It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays, presented to you by Film Seizure. Okay, so I kicked off 2021 with a 1999 remake of a popular monster movie. Then I went to 1953 to talk about a movie that was ultimately remade decades later that featured an invasion force from Mars. Now, this week I stay in 1953 to talk about an invasion force from, well, Mars. Is it coincidence, a theme, or am I just playing out of ideas for Monster Mondays? Well, maybe it's a little from each column. This week, it's the 1953 big daddy of all alien invasion movies, The War of the Worlds. And gosh, I mean, there's lots to talk about here with this movie. First, of course, it was a serialized story by H.G. Wells that was originally published in 1897 in Pearson's magazine in the UK and Cosmopolitan in the US. And I'm guessing that it was usually found right after the Cosmo questionnaire and test for, which knickers would most likely make your husband want to have the whoopee. But I digress. The novel is full of various possible interpretations of natural selection, human evolution, colonialism, imperialism, social Darwinism, various takes on religion, importance of science, and what have you. It also made a lot of predictions on the scientific level. Maybe its greatest prediction came from with the ideas of things like total war and chemical weapons. But first, let's talk about the total war thing. Basically, what it talked about and how the aliens kind of did their thing was find ways to destroy infrastructure to cause as high of a number of casualties as possible to basically snuff out the will to resist. And this is stuff that people took note of later into the 20th century as weapons became more and more mobile. And there's definite evidences, particularly in World War II, of that being, something that was employed. The idea of total war, just do everything you can to kind of, crush the resistance and the will for resistance. Oh, and let's not forget, as I mentioned before, the chemical weapon stuff. Martians used a black smoke weapon, which was a chemical weapon that would later more or less be developed and used just 20 years later in World War I. So obviously Wells' story was not just a great piece of science fiction, but also very influential in some pretty real world stuff and situations. Now, there are two greatly important adaptations of The War of the Worlds. The first being the 1938 Halloween Eve dramatic reading by Orson Welles. And then the 1953 movie I'm going to be talking about shortly. But let's talk about that radio drama, huh? It was 60 minutes in length and was part of the CBS radio series called The Mercury Theater on the Air. Now, the episode would go down in history for causing widespread panic and fear among those listening. But how did it go down? Well, the episode aired at 8 p.m. on Sunday, October 30th, 1938. The plot was to be told in sort of a fake regular broadcast that is then interrupted by this breaking story of a strange gas explosions that were seen on Mars, which leads into chaos shortly after a debate about whether or not there's actually life on Mars. And by about 8:30, the supervisor got a call demanding that there be some sort of announcement that this was a fictional news report because people were getting a little weird about everything that they were hearing and really kind of starting to buy into something. But by the time the order came, though, they were about to go into the first scheduled break, and it was a difficult place to try to stop and make the announcement needed. Soon, the police would raid the studio, and it was taking everything the producers and various others from CBS to basically stop the police from busting in and interrupting the broadcast. Now, several statements were later released, but the night of the broadcast was absolute bedlam in a way that no one could have predicted. Interestingly, future Tonight Show host Jack Paar was a radio host in Cleveland during the time, and he came on shortly after that broadcast went national. And phone lines were just lit up, and he kept trying to tell people that nothing was going on and the world was not ending. But interestingly, people believed that he was there to cover up the truth, that he was part of some sort of conspiracy theory. Gee, I wonder how that sounds familiar. But ultimately, the big stir was caused by people essentially tuning in late or hearing it secondhand. And basically, we're never hearing any announcement of it being a fictional dramatization, and the audience for this cultural show was actually usually pretty small. So they didn't really think that this would cause anything. But later, a study showed that most people did not even think it was an alien invasion, but either a German invasion or a natural catastrophe of some sort. Remember, the world was on the brink of, what else? Total war. People expected the radio to deliver factual news, concerns, and offer what to do as everything was getting worse and worse overseas. But let's talk about the movie. The film was produced by George Pal, who was a significant figure, having done Destination Moon and When Worlds Collide before this film, so he was not a stranger to quality science fiction. The director was Byron Haskin, who was a fairly experienced director, cinematographer, and special effects guy. The primary stars of this movie would be Gene Barry and Ann Robinson. They both would go on to have some pretty good careers. Barry would end up becoming Bat Masterson on TV, and the lead in the TV show Burke's Law, while Ann Robinson, who's actually still alive today, she's been in movies like Imitation of Life and Julie, but also appeared on several TV shows. In fact, she appeared in a few episodes of the late 80s War of the Worlds TV show and had a cameo in the 2005 Steven Spielberg version of the film too. George Pal very likely figured he'd have a huge hit on his hands with how much the 50s would be ramping up the exciting sci-fi horror films and how the radio drama basically played out, and he was right. The film garnered good box office and great reviews, as well as winning an Oscar for special effects, a category, by the way, that it was the only nomination that year. So I think most people agreed, I think the special effects are pretty good. So the movie opens with narration about how Mars watched the goings-on with Earth for some time because it was in bad shape. It was basically at the end of its livable cycle. So the Martians were basically looking for a place to migrate and colonize. The other planets in the solar system were too cold or too hot or too unsuitable in some way. But Earth was the exception. So suddenly, people in Southern California town of Linda Rosa witness what appears to be a meteorite landing, not realizing that it is not a meteorite, but more on that here in a minute. We meet Dr. Clayton Forrester. He's called in to investigate. And by the way, Dr. Clayton Forrester was the name of the evil scientist that launched test subjects up to the Satellite of Love to watch bad movies on a little show called Mystery Science Theater. So he was named such as a tip of the cap to War of the Worlds, of course. Now, by the following morning, quite a few locals have come to check out what's going on with the meteorite that has dug itself into the Earth. Very similar to the other 1953 movie we just talked about last week. But Forrester meets Sylvia Van Buren, who is a teacher of library science. And interestingly, Forrester is not recognized by Sylvia at first, but the way that he plays off who he is and how he eventually introduces himself is very similar to how Obi-Wan Kenobi introduced himself to Luke Skywalker and the audience in the original Star Wars. I'm going to assume that was a little bit of a tip of the cap by George Lucas. Forrester concludes that the meteorite has to be either incredibly light or hollow because it has left practically no crater. Clayton and Sylvia waste no time getting to know each other better and falling in love with one another because they decide to go to a square dance at the local hip joint while he waits for the meteorite to cool down. But that night, something begins to move on the meteorite. It's basically unscrewing a hatch, and after it opens that hatch, a blinking and glowing kind of periscope-like thing sticks its head out to look around. Now, some guys watching after the site to keep people away and to make sure it doesn't start any more fires because of the heat it gave off, decide to make first contact, but the aliens inside the ship decide to disintegrate them instead. The blast of the heat ray causes an electromagnetic pulse, which has knocked out phones, electricity, and even watches. But for some reason, it doesn't knock out planes or cars. Don't ask too many questions of this movie. But Clayton figures out that there are shenanigans at the crash site and decides to go check it out. Now soon, lots of people start showing up, including cops and locals and military, to check out what's going on. And before too long, they start getting blasted too. Finally, alien ships emerge from the various meteorites that have landed all over the world, and it's really cool how they do it. I'm going to talk a little bit more about those ships a little bit later, but it's pretty iconic in terms of science fiction. Now, soon the ships go on a rampage in basically a coordinated attack. Basically it's groups of 3 ships, and they're magnetically controlled, as they figured out, which is a really kind of fascinating idea and strategy that's kind of put into play here. But they basically they go in, and they're specific locations that the aliens have picked to land in and to triangulate their attacks. No human weapons are able to penetrate the electromagnetic shields that the Martian ships can protect themselves with. But Forrester figures that there has to be something that can stop them, because if they are mortal, then some sort of mortal means will ultimately stop them. Now keep that in mind. But in fact, some eggheads at a college study first a part of a Martian spy camera that Clayton and Sylvia encountered while hiding out in the farmhouse to see how the Martians are able to view things and how they see us. But more importantly, they look at a blood sample from a Martian guy that was also checking out the farmhouse that Forrester kind of hurt and made bleed. And they learn that while they are technologically advanced, their physiology is actually quite primitive, as their blood is rather anemic. Now, the aliens are so technologically advanced that if the atomic bombs the Americans plan to drop on them doesn't work, then the Martians will basically have totally conquered the world in only 6 days. And it does not work. Forrester and Sylvia and the science team try to get equipment in Los Angeles as the Martians close in, but they're separated in the chaos of the various riots and looting, and people are basically just looking after themselves. It's a really interesting statement on people who are, they're taking things, they're hoarding money, they're only looking after themselves, they're not helping each other. It's a very interesting thing to see in the 50s, which was mostly considered to be a quote-unquote kinder time, but not so much in this movie. Forrester eventually finds Sylvia in a church praying with various other refugees, and just as the church is about to be destroyed by the Martians, suddenly the ships lose power and crash. Forrester sees a Martian exiting one of the ships before it dies from an unexpected ally that defeats the invasion force when technology couldn't. Bacteria. So, let's talk about the 3 things that I like about this movie. First up, this has always been a really scary movie to me. I first saw this as a little kid, and it utterly terrified me. Whereas Invaders from Mars was about infiltration and destroying from the inside out, using former allies as their agents and so forth, this movie is just pure might. The Martians are just steamrolling through things. It kind of explores some of the higher concepts that H.G. Wells tends to do, with that total war, the whole idea of, the technological superiority is basically going to often potentially win out, but only for so long. But it's, the conquering invaders with greater technology that just is there to basically consume and supplant the native people as well. So that kind of goes into that colonialism idea. But they're not interested in peace as they blast anyone they see or approach them. It's really a total accident that we're able to defeat them. It also was always terrifying to me to think that these kind of unfeeling things had this technology that completely disintegrates a person, almost like completely wiping them from existence. I should probably point out that since I have made that comparison to Invaders from Mars about infiltration and so forth, the TV series War of the Worlds, there were instances of fairly important characters being just killed off, but also having the Martians kind of take over human bodies as well. And one thing that I think goes kind of overlooked with this movie, it's quite by accident that people win. It's the bacteria that the Martians aren't used to. It's all about ecosystems, right? Like within ecosystems, things will evolve to suit themselves in that ecosystem. And generally, as a planet-wide ecosystem, there's going to be bacteria and things that we're used to that an outsider would not be. And the unfortunate thing is that same rule would apply to us if we tried to colonize another planet. It would probably take a long time to properly adjust that planet's ecosystem for us to actually be able to survive on it without support. So in a way, it's cool to think about, traveling to other planets and doing all this other stuff. The unfortunate fact is that it's going to be a very difficult thing because of the ecosystem that we would be landing in. The Martians figured it out, unfortunately, too late in War of the Worlds. Now, second, the movie knows to get to the chase pretty early on, but also knows when to slow down, meaning pretty much if we were to go through this movie, within minutes of the movie starting, the aliens have landed. We only have about 5 or 10 minutes of speculative discussion before the aliens come out of their meteors. Then horror. The aliens begin wiping fools out left and right. Then the movie slows down and turns more into a disaster film where we learn the Martians are just waging war all over the planet and how people are reacting to it. But also the personal interactions with Clayton and Sylvia and how they're growing together and how she talks about having had this kind of life full of faith, and her uncle was a preacher. Of course, that preacher got blasted by the Martians earlier in the film, but it teaches him to know where to find her later. But we don't stay in the drama or the disaster part too long before we have a wonderful scene of tension with Clayton and Sylvia hiding from the red, blue, green camera like eye thing that is snaking around the house that they're hiding in before we see a really creepy purple Martian dude stalking around that they have to fend off and fight off. The movie is a little bit of everything that makes for a particularly exciting little movie. Third, the special effects and design of the Martian stuff is just amazing. I really love the design of the ships. This is some of the best design work in any science fiction anything. Everything about the Martians are done in threes, and the first evidence of that is that the ships are kind of triangular or pyramid shaped with port and aft kind of corners, and the eye that sticks up out of the center of the ship kind of acting as the like the third point or the third corner of the triangle, but that's the eye that shoots out the heat beam and so forth. But while the novel and later adaptations of the story would follow the walking style of vehicles that are tripod in nature, that is still actually referenced here, as Forrester concludes that the ships don't actually fly. They actually have 3 beams of some sort of electromagnetic powered legs that keep them elevated. They're just intangible. So they aren't floating or flying, but actually walking. The aliens also have 3 fingers, 3 distinct pupils, so everything is in threes. The design and some of the science around how they move or see or what have you, I mean, these are all pretty exquisitely thought out. It's a real masterpiece of design and artistic rendition. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found, like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook and Twitter, and you can follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, head over to www.bmovieenema.com, which is my website, and you can read a new text article each and every Friday. And if you want to watch a movie, well, there's an episodic B-Movie Enema series now on YouTube. New episodes will be coming out every Saturday evening from January 2nd to March 27th, 2021. So come watch a full movie with me on YouTube by searching for B-Movie Enema, or you can go over to the B-Movie Enema website. So until next week, stay spooky.